My name is Mike Mackenzie. I'm 47 years old, have been married for more than 2 decades to the same wonderful woman, and I'm the father of 3 children. And until that day, I considered myself an ordinary guy. I worked full-time at an industrial maintenance workshop in Arizona, where I have lived for years and led a simple life, with a routine full of schedules, bills, and responsibilities. I wasn't exactly a model of faith, even though I had been raised in a Christian family. I always believed in God, but over time, faith became something more automatic, like a drawer you only open when you need something. My life changed completely at the end of May 2019 during a trip to Southern California. We were all together to celebrate the wedding of my eldest son, which was already a huge milestone for me, seeing my boy build his own family. I just didn't imagine that in that same week, I myself would cross the line between life and death. 2 days before the wedding, we went with the grandchildren to a large park that had wooden adventure rides. I got excited, played with the children, climbed on a rope structure, slid down a slide, and returned home with a strange feeling in my body. That night, I felt chills and an uncomfortable pain on the right side of my belly. I thought it was a flu, or at most something I ate. I didn't want to worry anyone, so I took an analgesic and carried on. The next day, the pain intensified, but the wedding was so close, I couldn't ruin everything. I was sweating cold, and my belly felt like it was burning from the inside, but I forced a smile, put on my suit, and walked to the altar to give my son away. I remember almost fainting after the photos. It was only after the reception back at home that my wife noticed that my skin was yellowish and that I could barely walk. She rushed me to the hospital, and that's where everything went downhill. At the hospital, everything happened very quickly. I was still conscious when I arrived, but I felt as if my body was shutting down in slow motion. The doctors started running tests and soon came with the verdict. My appendix had ruptured, and judging by the state of the infection, they believed that it had happened at least 3 days earlier. I was in shock. I had always associated appendicitis with an acute pain that makes you scream on the floor, but in my case it was sneaky, disguised, and almost killed me without a fuss. They began to hurry to prepare the emergency. Surgery. My wife held my hand with an expression mixing panic and faith, that desperate faith you activate when you have nothing left to do. The smell of the hospital, the sound of the monitors, the chill of the IV fluid entering my vein. Everything seemed much more intense. I remember looking up at the ceiling of the operating room and thinking, is this how it ends? I wasn't ready. I still had so much to live, to say, to fix. The anesthesiologist asked me to count to 10, and I didn't even reach 7. I blacked out, and that's where things start to become difficult to explain. I don't know how much time passed, but the next thing I remember is being standing, yes, standing, in a completely different place. It wasn't the hospital, nor a dark room, nor a dream. I was standing in a field that seemed to have a life of its own. The ground was made of a grass that looked like liquid silk and moved slightly as if dancing to a music I couldn't hear but felt. The air had a strange density, as if it were charged with energy, yet it was light to breathe. I looked around trying to understand where I was, and that's when I noticed something approaching. A presence. It wasn't a frightening or comforting figure. It was as if the very air were clearing a path for someone to arrive. My heart, or whatever was beating in my chest at that moment, pounded with a mix of reverence and amazement. I knew, even before seeing the face, that this was not human. And then he appeared. He didn't come riding on clouds, nor with lightning or trumpets. He simply was there. He appeared as if he had been there all along, and I just hadn't been able to see him. It was Jesus. But not as depicted in the paintings we see in churches or in children's Bibles. His face was strong, tanned, with Middle Eastern features, eyes that seemed to contain universes within them. Alive, penetrating, but full of a compassion that almost made me collapse. He wore a simple tunic, unadorned, yet at the same time he radiated a light that wasn't of this world. It wasn't just visible light, it was a light I felt, like warmth and relief at once, as if every cell of my being were being embraced. He smiled, a smile so calm and sincere that it disassembled me from within. He extended his hand toward me and said something that made me freeze. "I came to answer that prayer you made when you were just a boy." In that very moment, my mind was pulled back to an old memory that I didn't even know still existed. I must have been about 7 years old. I was alone in my room, kneeling by the bed after hearing a story about heaven at Sunday school. I remember closing my eyes tightly and whispering, "Jesus, one day, just let me see heaven, even if it's just a little bit." I had never thought about it again, but there he was, telling me that he had heard. Not only heard, he remembered. It was as if he had kept that request in a secret place, waiting for the right moment. And now, at 47, between life and death, he had come to fulfill that childhood prayer. When he touched my hand, it was as if the ground beneath my feet disappeared. I was transported in the blink of an eye to another place. I didn't walk, I didn't fly, I just was there. A field opened before me, with hills covered in flowers that seemed to breathe. Yes, breathe. The petals moved as if dancing with the wind, and each flower emitted a soft sound, almost like the notes of a harp being plucked by invisible hands. The sky above had no sun, but was illuminated with a golden light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't speak. I just felt. As I tried to absorb that place, I realized that it wasn't just the beauty that left me speechless. It was the sense of belonging. I wasn't visiting a strange place. I was coming home. It was as if every little piece of that world knew who I was, as if everything had been waiting for me. In the distance, I saw structures that looked like cities, but they weren't. Like ours. They had golden domes that shone with a soft glow, gentle on the eyes. The construction seemed made of crystal and wind, solid and ethereal at the same time. There were no walls, only paths crossing as if they were meant to unite rather than separate. I saw figures walking along these paths. Some appeared human, others I couldn't quite describe. They were beings of light, yet with distinct forms, as if representing different aspects of creation. And the most impressive, none of them seemed rushed. There was a profound peace in every gesture, a tranquility that made it seem as if time there didn't exist, or, if it did, it didn't matter. Jesus walked beside me, but I didn't need to ask anything. It was as if my mind were connected to his. I thought, and the answer came, not in words, but in understanding. At one point we stopped before an elevation, a hill covered with silvery grass, soft as foam. At the top, a light shone with such intensity that my eyes, even though not in pain, filled with tears. It wasn't a physical light, it was the very glory of God. There, before that manifestation, my legs gave out. I kneeled without thinking. It was like being in the presence of something so perfect, so pure, that any trace of ego, pride, or doubt disappeared. I was nothing there, and at the same time I felt completely loved. There was no judgment, only truth. It was as if everything I had tried to hide my entire life had been placed before him. And even so, he accepted me. I cried uncontrollably, but it wasn't sadness. It was relief, reverence, gratitude, and a love so overwhelming that no human word could describe it. It was in that moment, kneeling on that celestial hill, that I felt something change. A strange sound began to echo in the background, a distant buzzing that grew, becoming a kind of dry snap, like electricity breaking through the air. The light started to vibrate, and for a second I thought something was wrong. I looked at Jesus, and he just stared at me, with an expression mixing serenity and sadness. He knew I didn't want to leave that place. I tried to hold on to that living grass, tried to resist, but it was futile. My body, or my soul, I don't know, began to be forcefully pulled. It was as if I were being sucked into an invisible whirlwind. The sound grew sharper, more aggressive, until suddenly an acute pain exploded in my chest. It was as if 1,000 needles were burning inside me all at once. I opened my eyes with a stifled cry, and all I saw was a bunch of faces around me, bright lights, and the frantic sound of beeping monitors. The doctors were all over me, and one of them was still holding the defibrillator electrodes. My chest burned. My throat felt as if it had been scraped from the inside. I blinked, not understanding anything, trying to remember where I was, who those people were. The first thing that came to my mind was, where is he? Where is that place? I felt like someone who woke up from a dream so real that the world around seems fake. One of the doctors said something like, "He's back," and I could only think about how much I wanted to go back there. But when I looked to my side and saw my wife crying, holding my hand as if she would never let go again, something inside me calmed. I was still alive. God had brought me back, and even without understanding the reason at that moment, I knew it wasn't by chance. The recovery was painful, slow. I spent days in the hospital with tubes, medications, and a weakness I had never felt before. But inside, something in me was no longer the same. I didn't know how to tell anyone what I had experienced without sounding crazy. It took me a few days to muster the courage to tell my wife. She noticed that I was quieter than usual, staring into nothingness, as if trying to remember something very important. It was on an ordinary afternoon, with the sunlight coming through the crack of the hospital room curtain, that I held her hand and said, "I saw Jesus." She smiled faintly, thinking I was speaking metaphorically, until I started describing every detail: the field, the dancing flowers, the golden domes, the touch of his hand, the childhood prayer. I remember her putting her hand to her mouth, her eyes welling up and softly saying, "You've always been special, Mike. I just didn't know how much." Gradually, I told her everything I remembered. Every detail seemed etched in fire within me, as if it had happened just minutes ago. And the more I spoke, the more I felt that this wasn't just a memory, it was a mission. When I returned home weeks later, I no longer saw the world in the same way. Things that used to irritate me, the traffic, the bills, the complaining boss, began to seem too trivial. I started to pay more attention to the sky, the wind rustling the trees, the laughter of my children. It was as if everything had gained a new layer of color and meaning. I began to slow down, to put my phone aside. During dinner, to be grateful for the little things: the smell of coffee in the morning, a tight hug from a child, the silence of the early hours. But the most profound change was in my relationship with God. I no longer prayed as if following a protocol, but as if conversing with someone real, intimate, present. I started reading the Bible with new eyes, thirsting as if every page could take me back to that celestial hill. And inside me, something became steadfast. I was no longer afraid of death. The unknown already had a face, and that face was pure love. Even with all this new peace, there came a moment when I started to question myself. Why did he show me that, and then bring me back? Wouldn't it have been easier to just let me stay there, in that place where there was no pain, where everything made sense? I spent nights awake with that question circling in my head. It was on a Sunday, months after the surgery, that the answer came. I was at church, sitting in a pew with my family, and the pastor read a verse from Philippians. "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." That struck me deeply. I realized that my time here was not over because there was something I needed to do, or perhaps someone I needed to be. I understood that my role was not just to remember the experience, but to live in a way that reflected that glory I had seen, to share, inspire, love with greater intention. And if someone, at some point, looked at me and felt a bit of that light, it would all be worth coming back. Since then, many people have sought me out to hear my story. Friends, relatives, even strangers. Some listen with wide eyes, others with skepticism, but almost all tell me that something in them changed after hearing it. I'm not a pastor nor a missionary. I'm just an ordinary man who saw what few see and came back. My mission isn't to convince anyone, but to testify. Sometimes when I'm alone, I close my eyes and remember that hill. Sometimes I even smell the wind from there, and whenever I wonder if it was real, something inside me smiles. It wasn't just real, it was more real than this. But now I am here, and that, too, is purpose. I live with more lightness, more humility. Every hug, every cup of coffee, every sunrise, everything tastes like a miracle. And when my time comes, I know that He will be waiting for me again. This time, perhaps, to show me everything I couldn't see on the first visit. Today, I carry with me a kind of gratitude. That is hard to explain. The pain, the surgery, the risk of death, all of it was a disguised gift. Sometimes you have to reach the brink of the end to understand the value of now. I don't wish for anyone to go through what I went through, but if someone is living something similar, if they feel that they've reached their limit, I want to say, it's not the end. There is more, much more. A more that words cannot describe and that no camera could ever capture. I saw, I touched, and even though I came back, even though I'm bound by the limitations of this life, a part of me never left there. I carry that part with me as a beacon, as a reminder that heaven is not a distant place. Sometimes it comes close to us in silence, in the midst of pain, in the midst of doubt. If you're reading this and feel that emptiness that nothing seems to fill, know that I know that feeling. I lived with it for years. Even though I had a beautiful family, a stable job, health, something was missing, and that something was the living presence of God, which is now part of my everyday life. No, my life hasn't turned into a fairy tale. I still have bills, back pains, and hard days, but now I know with absolute certainty that there is a place waiting for me, and that death isn't the end, but a return, a reunion, and when that day comes, I won't feel fear. I'll close my eyes, and I believe that Jesus will extend His hand again with that same calm smile and say, "Now, Mike, come see the rest."